The events of Sunbreak's story were driven chiefly by a long-standing period of interspecific strife between two species of elder dragon, and their mutualistic relationships with the tiny beasts known as qurio. How could this three-way struggle have first evolved? And what may it tell us about the biology of its participants? First off, a huge thanks to Phenomenon for sponsoring this video using the Zora Magdaros patron tier. Their kindness and support for this channel and this video's creation can't be stressed enough, as they also agreed to wait for Primordial Malzeno to come out too, hence its delay. So hopefully after all that, it's worth it. So the bulk of the story revolves around the actions of Gaismagorm, the archdemon of the Abyss, a giant fossorial elder dragon at least partially known to the people around Elgado, but only properly categorized in the events of Sunbreak's story. A look at Gaismagorm tells you it's undergone significant adaptations for burrowing, and may imply some things about the underworld from which it came. Whilst it's tempting to compare Gaismagorm to a mole, moles are really weird, even by Elder Dragon standards, and Gaismagorm isn't anywhere near as morphologically derived as one. They have a unique morphology to dig, unlike other animals, including a surprisingly slender scapula, an extra false toe to walk on, and cranially organised limbs. This is all because they're literally constantly making new burrows and digging. Gaismagorm may well be more comparable to something like a badger. It still digs and burrows a lot and is adapted to do so, but not quite to the cracked standard of a mole. So Gaismagorm is likely a scratch digger, which is what it sounds like in that it scrapes the earth in front of it with alternating limbs to excavate more chambers. From this we can expect a hugely robust scapula and humerus in particular, so it's not surprising Gaismagorm can throw such boulders with ease. The middle limbs may be to help move displaced earth either under the body or to the sides, letting Gaismagorm turn its body almost into a sort of conveyor belt of moving and compacting earth. Gaismagorm's comparatively long neck and tall posture also imply it may not just live its life in cramped burrows of its own making either, and so the subterranean world it inhabits may be reasonably spacious for it to move around in. Giant cave systems with their own underground rivers do exist. And with other elders like Shara Ishvalda being even more active burrowers, there may well be giant underground ecosystems. Whilst likely much more akin to the Locust's Hollow than the Monsterverse's more nonsensical Hollow Earth, Gaismagorm and Shara may well just be the world-shaping titans of a subterranean kingdom full of life. Gaismagorm is still just one of a species, and meetings with other Gaismagorm in this kingdom may not often be friendly, with potentially limited resources. This may be the reason for Gaismagorm's bizarre luminous mouth, a warning against other Gaismagorm. Sarcastic fringeheads have similar such mouths, and males use the gape to warn each other away. On seeing other such males, they'll often gape instantly, leading to the lesser male retreating or mouth-to-mouth combat. Yet this may be to reduce fighting. Why fight when you can show who the bigger male is with your gape, as it's a good indicator of overall size? Considering that Gaismagorm may not have great eyesight, it lives underground and is immune to flash bombs, it may take a giant luminous blue pentagon to have a signal large and bright enough for them to communicate simply with one another and avoid a fight if possible. It could also be that it provides a visual stimuli for Curio to head to when they return to the lair, like adult birds innately responding to the coloured gapes of their chicks with food. That's if Curio can see it all. Why Gaismagorm opened the sinkhole to the surface isn't explicitly stated, but it may be it's possible to do with reproduction. Its description states that it's a place to nest, and why Gaismagorm needs one and the extra food from the curio could well be explained by it needing to breed. The long cyclic nature of it happening seemingly every century could be similar to how it's believed Shagaru Magala may reproduce too, with the concurrent frenzy outbreaks occurring in a similar pattern. And if not the act of parturition itself, it could be Gaismagorm building a structure and environment to entice the opposite sex with, like a very destructive bowerbird. On the other hand, there are a lot of potential reasons that may force Gaismagorm to the surface for food and a home. Tunnel flooding or collapse, natural prey depletion, being forced out by another Gaismagorm or other elder. And from what we see of Gaismagorm, it doesn't look pregnant or gravid. So if it is giving birth, then the young are likely pretty small. And as with many things in the history of Monster Hunter, a sample size of n equals 2 isn't exactly what you'd call statistically robust. When we know so little about Gaismagorm, the question of what does it need from the surface that it can't get from the caves is hard to say. It could also just be as simple as an eruptive migration brought out by a comparative lack of food in the underground, and Gaismagorm doesn't have much of a real plan afterwards other than feed on the curio. When doing said feeding, Gaismagorm does just seem to simply vacuum in all the curio, but it's hard to tell what happens after. At points in the fight, it later spits seemingly live curio at you, and so while at least some curio are digested and any that die inside Gaismagorm are just consumed, it may be they live to some extent inside Gaismagorm too. Considering how much of Gaismagorm's hide is thick and heavily armoured, it could just be easier for the curio to transfer nutrients by attaching themselves to the soft inner mouth and esophagus. This could also be something of a suggestion of different ranks of curio. There may be some that live for long periods with Gaismagorm and make multiple trips, and some are just bred as one-time disposable food items to be eaten after their first successful voyage. Ants, after all, do feed their young and queens with their own typically unfertilized eggs. So growing large amounts of biomass for higher social members in an organization isn't unheard of. But how may this bizarre relationship have first come about between the two? Well, it probably arose from them being in fairly close proximity to start with, and likely Gaismagorm being an unideal host. Oxpeckers are well known for their close relationships with large ungulates on the African savannas, and whilst there's debate as to whether this is parasitism or mutualism, with some studies suggesting both depending on the host, it can't be denied this is a uniquely close ecological relationship. The oxpeckers don't just feed on the hosts, they build nests from their fur, warn them of incoming danger, and even roost on them at night too when not on eggs. So how did this come about? And it seems most likely it built up from a lesser form of it. Oxpeckers are some of the oldest members of the Sternidae, which is thrushes, miners and starlings. After corvids, sternids have the most frequent interaction cleaning ungulates and feeding off parasites. Birds like miners often feed on or around large herbivores, but in a less dependent way and with a lot of other behaviours seen in oxpeckers being non-existent. But it's a clear bedrock for such things to build off. So perhaps the curios started out as just parasites of Gaismagorm, with it being their chief host as the largest and most exploitable prey item in the deep subterranean caverns. Despite their wings, they eventually stopped just feeding on Gaismagorm, and eventually lived adjacent to and on its body, potentially even using it to reproduce as well. The only other deep earth denizen we know about right now is Shara Ishvalda, who coats itself entirely in rock, quite possibly as the most successful anti-predator defense against curio. Other elders have failed in this area despite their abilities. Gaismagorm isn't, and presumably wasn't, completely defenseless though, and like many other elders it has weaponized aspects of its epidermis as seen in Gaismagorm's final fight stages, when it can expel considerable amounts of fire from the open slits in its skin, and the bizarre gill-like protrusions that come from them. This is no doubt expensive to do, and so ancestrally would have likely chiefly been used on big swarms when accosted, and not worth it for just a few biting curio. Not perfect, but then parasitism is a part of life. So in the early evolutionary stages of this relationship, how did the curio manage to give things back to sufficiently sweeten the deal for Gaismagorm? And maybe through the weird way blood-sucking animals can both feed and be affected by pathogens. Mosquitoes spread diseases such as malaria due to them regurgitating saliva, and sometimes a small amount of red blood cells, into the bite. And similarly, fleas spread the bubonic plague due to the fact it causes a blockage in their gut that makes them regurgitate part of their last meal, and the pathogen, into their new host. Maybe in the early evolutionary history, or maybe even still today, the The relationship between qurio and Gaismagorm is facilitated by the virus. Qurio may partially regurgitate their last meals into Gaismagorm when they return to it, and when you have as many qurio as Gaismagorm does, that's a lot of biomass. Generally, shooting yourself up with someone else's or another species' blood doesn't end well for you, but elder dragons are weird and it's likely this isn't raw blood, but has undergone partial processing by the qurio too to make it a more compatible substance. This may have started with infected qurio doing this when they came to feed on Gaismagorm, and when large numbers did, Gaismagorm was aware of the harvestable biomass, and so didn't repel the qurio but rather allowed them to feed in turn. Over millennia, this then developed into the relationship it is today, Gaismagorm being fed by its qurio and occasionally eating them too, whereas the qurio get a warm, mobile home and nursery, a reliable long-lived host, and protection. But what about the qurio themselves? What even are qurio, and how did they get where they are today? The qurio do seem to strongly resemble a mix of winged lampreys and neonate giganox, and overall do seem to be most similar to the cave wyverns. They have unornamented skin and heavily reduced eyes, as well as feeding by latching onto another monster and draining it of blood. But they're also reasonably skilled flyers too, with strong wings for their size, so cautiously suggesting them as tiny cave wyverns may not be so far-fetched. But how did they get from the likes of Kezu and Giganox to the little lamprey vampires they are in-game? And the most likely explanation is pedomorphism. This is to say that they retained juvenile traits into adulthood. With their close resemblance to Giggies, they could well share a common ancestor. But the qurio underwent a branch of pedomorphism called progenesis, which is the gonads becoming functional while still in a larval stage, allowing what is otherwise a physically immature animal to be sexually reproductive. This can happen when populations get cut off from others with the right selective pressures. And cave and tunnel networks are one such place where giggies, or rather whole egg sacs, could get lost. Whilst we don't know what other fauna is down there, it could have been better to stay small and live as a parasite rather than grow larger in the deep levels, either due to food availability or the threat of competition and/or predation. Without the parent giganox, the young may have also struggled to stay warm enough without relying on a host. The limb nub could have then become proper wings with time to allow for flights between hosts and dispersal. In some animals, the lack of metamorphosis can limit dispersal and thus genetic diversity, and the qurio flight may well be a response to this. Ancestrally, qurio would likely still have the ability to grow wings, although theirs became functional unlike giganox's. The qurio feed like many ectoparasites by attaching themselves to hosts, and draining them of blood, or life, and have little qualms about killing their hosts. The word host is maybe too simple a title in some ways, as both Gaismagorm and monsters killed by the qurio are hosts, just that Gaismagorm is the primary host with a mutualistic relationship, and the other monsters are chiefly food hosts. Elders at present seem to be the only animals capable of withstanding qurio swarms, presumably due to their weaponized epidermal abilities. This may not just be a coincidence, and considering the lack of success in altering the outcome of competitive interactions with other monsters, such abilities may not be for fights, and may well have a large role in parasite protection or reduction, and especially for qurio. Whilst the virus itself seems to be lethal against most monsters seen, elders included, it also does seem from repeated feeding that qurio can kill monsters outright, and this is within the capabilities of ectoparasites. Ticks can kill surprisingly large animals, and can play a notable factor in causing large die-offs of moose in their southerly, although increasingly northerly with climate change, range. Multiple factors like vegetation quality and winter conditions can also go into this, but it's still significant a big enough parasite load can indeed kill megafauna. Analysis on moose calves, the most vulnerable age class, shows how such things go down, and can be analogues to qurio swarm attacks. For a moose calf of the year, between 150 and 175 kilograms, conservative estimates for weeks of peak engorgement periods for a severe infestation can consume 112% of the animal's blood volume, and over 200% for less conservative ones. with up to 8% of total blood volume drained per day. Obviously, this would quickly bring on anemia, and to chronic, acute, and potentially fatal levels too. As well as this, even if not fatal outright from anemia, the metabolic cost of replacing still non-fatal levels of blood can be a significant drain by itself, especially on the animal's protein levels. This accelerates a severe loss in condition and causes extreme physiological stress, so animals don't even have to be literally drained dry for a smaller infestation to be very serious. Qurio are less numerous but a lot bigger and likely more metabolically active than ticks, even in relative terms, and so a lot less qurio may be needed for a fatal attack. Plus, once one qurio finds an animal, they may have a rolling conveyor belt of feeding qurio, instead of a finite amount of ticks one animal can carry. Overall, it's not hard to see how so many monsters were completely overwhelmed prior to emergence. On top of this, the qurio also spread a virus, only known unimaginatively as the qurio virus. This is the cause of afflicted and risen monsters, with it being fatal in the former unless they succeed in becoming the latter. Unlike frenzy, monsters can't spread it between themselves, nor catch it without direct feeding from the qurio, which is something of a relief. It also has fewer and less noticeable symptoms, with the most obvious being vasodilation causing a red flush all over the body. Presumably, this is to make it easier for the qurio, who only feed on the outer layers of the body and don't burrow in deeper. This is also likely the eventual cause of death, cardiac arrest stemming from refractory vasodilatory shock, and/or blood loss. This also likely explains the difference in colour between normal and primordial Malzeno, with the former's wings being constantly flushed with blood. The behavioural changes may not be brought on by anything the virus actually does to the brain, but more a response of the constant physiological stress of the virus. After all, sick and wounded animals are often at their most dangerous, and afflicted monsters are in very poor condition indeed. Any boosts of strength in its delirious state likely just come from adrenaline, before this wears off and leaves the monster in its exhausted, pacified state. But historically, monsters haven't been the only ones suffering, and in prior outbreaks, younger qurio, apparently unable to tackle large prey like adult monsters, fed mainly on humans. Whether or not this is the same brood later is unknown, but it's also not impossible. Small animals can still have surprisingly long lifespans, parrots and tortoises for one commonly known example, but even invertebrates too. Baboon spiders and ant queens can approach or exceed 30. After the death of their primary host Gaismagorm and the adaptive host Malzeno, it could be argued that the qurio attacks got even worse with the spread of the anomaly and afflicted monsters. The surviving qurio no longer had another animal to report back to and roost on, and in the reasonably chilly boreal environment of the citadel and surrounds, they may have also been suffering considerable physiological stress from staying warm. As such, more of these leaderless qurio crowded individual monsters for longer periods, trying to find both food and a roost, and wound up infecting and killing even more monsters than beforehand. The guild doesn't seem worried about the long-term effects of this, with afflicted monsters being terminal once selected, but it's unknown how long and how well the qurio last without a true host. Whether they'd continue to survive in this state for long periods is unknown, or if without a true host, predation, lost individuals, starvation, and other mortality would whittle the lost population into localized extinction. It's unknown how much of a social structure the qurio have for themselves whilst living with Gaismagorm. Is it just one big colony or multiple smaller ones from different lineages? After Gaismagorm's death, a single individual is seen to survive and leave after the rest perish, and it's hard to tell how much significance this has. It could just be a lucky survivor, or qurio could have something akin to nuptial flights and new social insects, where mature individuals leave their colony, mate, and start one of their own. This could be how qurio retain genetic diversity as they swap between hosts, or if Gaismagorm's own emergence is related to reproduction, then it could have been an individual preparing to move to the baby Gaismagorm. With the amount of backwash between the two, they may well be pretty attuned to each other's hormones and life stages. Some ant queens will take a dowry of fungi from their own birth colony to start their own, and maybe the first qurio to partner with a neonate Gaismagorm has its own strand of the virus, or a certain hormone, pheromone, or other substance to kickstart that relationship. This is assuming, of course, it didn't instead try to find primordial Malzeno. So, also evolutionarily, how did Malzeno rear his ugly head to become the third wheel of this partnership? As clearly, Malzeno isn't just another elder in his relationship to the qurio. Unlike the frenzy virus, many elder dragons are vulnerable to the qurio virus and parasitic swarms and perish in outbreaks. Risen elders are rare, and still seemingly sickly animals, even if very dangerous. This resistance and partnership suggests some considerable shared history. Considering how it doesn't seem qurio openly select for any particular taxa when in their adult form, there doesn't seem to be much reason for Malzeno to be especially well defended against them, unless it was the one instigating the conflict. If the qurio can forage and donate sufficient volumes of blood to feed Gaismagorm, then they have enough biomass to feed Malzeno too. And swarm following is a legitimate evolutionary strategy. As the name would suggest, some antbirds are dependent on swarming army ants for their food. Obligate antbird species get most of their forage from small animals fleeing the ants, or pilfering animals being dragged off. They continually track the colonies, and each keep tabs on their food source, and as one would expect, this partially decreases army ant foraging success. There are non-obligate antbirds too, ones who still get a good chunk of their nutrients from following swarms, but aren't completely dependent on it, and Malzeno is likely in this category. Enriched qurio returning to Gaismagorm may well be a good meal if you can get enough of them, but qurio also leave behind numerous corpses in their wake that are also suitable meals for anything carnivorous, and carved descriptions do seem to imply Malzeno is normally carnivorous. All this seems like a bit much for something that only happens once every few decades, so it may well be possible Malzeno often enter the underground tunnels to feast on enriched qurio, and the bodies they leave behind in subterranean ecosystems. Malzeno has to be doing something that puts it in far more regular contact with qurio than other species, and this seems to be the most reasonable option with the given info. But with the reason for the frequent encounters suggested, that's still not enough to save Malzeno. If he ran in and started eating them, he'd get demolished by the swarm pretty quickly. Qurio also fiercely defend Gaismagorm too, and become hostile to anything that threatens a true host. And as a result of this close proximity, Malzeno likely evolved similar pheromones to Gaismagorm, to prevent the qurio simply killing it. And this isn't as rare as you think. Using ants as an example again, there are some species of snail that will emit various pheromones that mean that ants don't eat them, but rather carry them. One of the all snails, Alopias meromachophilos, secretes a foam that attracts ants, and tricks them into thinking they're already captured food or ant eggs. They live peacefully in the colony feeding on the other things ants bring in, and when the colony moves they get carried like royalty to the next nest. Similarly, caterpillars of great blue butterflies when found by ants get a similar treatment. They get carted off to the nest and are cleaned vigorously and fed on ant eggs themselves. In some cases it seems the caterpillars may not just code themselves as eggs, but royal larvae, or not, depending on the circumstance, so they get preferential treatment. So Malzeno may have developed a pheromone or pheromones that first started as the qurio ignoring them for safety and facilitating their predation, and then with some time Malzeno amplified this to trick the qurio into thinking they're the true host themselves. If the qurio only really have this relationship with Gaismagorm, then Malzeno essentially tricks the qurio into thinking it's another Gaismagorm. It does seem this is something any Malzeno can do, as Primordial seems to have this ability even if it doesn't seem to select for qurio. Whilst we're told Primordial is just a normal pre-qurio Malzeno, the advancement of the relationship between base Malzeno and qurio seems far beyond just a forced tolerance, considering it can command them to feed for it, and it has significantly different morphology to Primordial. It could be one is a subspecies of the other, with one preferentially using qurio where possible, and the other not doing so. Base Malzeno has the weirder and more pronounced dentition, with a weird sort of dental hinge almost giving it a saw of teeth. A few animals have weird jaws and weird maxilla hooks, but some can get even weirder. Perhaps the king of this category was Helicoprion, the prehistoric shark most would recognise as the one with a buzzsaw for a face. It's believed the weird tooth wall was to snag soft prey and then pull it back into the mouth, especially for prey like ammonites to suck them out of the shell as well. So again, this division may be due to their different relationships with the qurio. As well as the hormonal command, base Malzeno may also still preferentially eat enriched qurio, at least wherever possible, and this is what developed the whole relation. Qurio are still likely soft, struggling prey that Malzeno could have specialised equipment to eat, albeit not requiring the level of Helicoprion. The latter still had a strong bite, although one that wasn't ideally suited to hard prey due to the arrangement of the teeth. However, it could still be used to consume more typical prey. So also when feeding on more typical prey, Malzeno may just rake in the softer tissues. Modern sharks just bite and shake, and it's believed the abundance of shelled soft prey may have led to Helicoprion's saw jaws. Perhaps Malzeno's slender horns may prevent it properly shoving its head into large carcasses to get stuck in like our assorted carnivores, and means it feeds with a similar method even on big carcasses, with vertical movements of the head and a preference for the softer tissues, rather than a lot of gnawing and shaking using the back teeth especially. All of this may play a major role in the conflict between the two when Gaismagorm rises to the surface. At first glance, it's hard to imagine what the coughing baby of Malzeno could possibly do to the hydrogen bomb of Gaismagorm. And in a raw physical cage match only, it seems abundantly clear that Malzeno gets snapped like a stale breadstick. But the pheromones may make all the difference. For a start, pheromones similar to another Gaismagorm may well make it less willing to both emerge and stay in a prolonged fight with another elder. But more importantly, Malzeno usurping or threatening to usurp a large number of the qurio could be a potentially lethal threat. The derived relationship between the two means that Gaismagorm is likely entirely dependent on the qurio, and queens aren't quite as powerful as their name implies. And they're much more dependent on and at the mercy of their daughters, especially because queen brains undergo significant changes, reducing in volume by quite a bit. Because when you sit around in the dark and lay eggs all day, you don't need to think about doing much else. They have reduced behaviours and abilities to care for themselves as a result of this, and Gaismagorm is likely the same. Clearly, Gaismagorm can still fight, is a mobile organism, and can even use its secreted fire blasts. But with things regarding feeding and foraging, Gaismagorm may well be near or completely useless. It's slow, conspicuous, and unsuccessfully tries to suck in the player, over attempting a bite or anything similar. In short, Gaismagorm may not be able to feed or forage for itself without the qurio, and so someone trying to steal them off you is an existential threat. Gaismagorm may have some way of recognising how many qurio are still returning to it, how many it needs and how many are missing. Upon losing a certain amount, it may well just choose to cut its losses and retreat to lower levels. Gaismagorm is seemingly unaware of Malzeno's theft, with the description of it sending qurio after Malzeno afterwards too. But then that was a long time ago and could also be misinterpreted or distorted events. Malzeno is, after all, unfairly believed to be Gaismagorm's silver right hand, sent forth to bring destruction, when in reality Malzeno's presence in such areas could be a major factor in keeping Gaismagorm underground due to this ability, and their hunting could result in eruptive qurio events. In the world of Monster Hunter, there's the ancient civilization, an extinct lineage of people with amazing technological and architectural feats for their time. They created the switch axe and built the Great Tower, and they disappeared in unknown but likely rapid circumstances. With the clear demonstration of what Gaismagorm and the Qurio can do to a kingdom, if the ancient civilization for one reason or another hunted Malzeno intensively, and possibly to the point of localized extinctions, then this could have facilitated an eruptive event, or multiple ones at once, on a scale sufficient to eradicate the entire organization almost overnight. The myth of the Great Dragon War that's been erroneously repeated ad nauseum may not be so far from the truth, but the divine punishment to devour the ancient civilization came from the abyss instead of the heavens. It may also be possible Malzeno has some case of Curio brain itself too, as well as the obvious use of Curio to feed itself. When it attacks the hunting party from Elgato, after Lunagaron is slain, it ignores the panicking trapped Popo in front of it, to allow the Curio to feed on Lunagaron's body. This is a pretty perfect scenario where you'd expect to see a predator engage in surplus killing. with trapped prey animals unable to defend themselves but still engaging in stimuli to trigger an attack. Both of these factors may hint Malzeno has also undergone some cerebral changes as a result of curio bonding. After all, the change in ant queens happens in the individual in a relatively small space of time, so a similar change in a single Malzeno's lifestyle isn't impossible. And if normal and primordial are genetically different, normal may be more predisposed to such a relationship and then such an effect. Otherwise, Malzeno does seem happy to let the curio do some of the legwork. When killing prey itself, Malzeno can often seem unwilling to feed, rather just letting the curio feed and then return to Malzeno to transfer processed nutrients. And like Gaismagorm and prior to curio infection, Malzeno does still consume prey normally with its teeth, apparently capable of puncturing tough armour. With its far smaller body and less room for curio, it may be possible Malzeno on occasion still eats normally, as it may struggle to support itself entirely on curio donations. When living a more typical lifestyle, both types of Malzeno do seem suited for a semi-arboreal or mountainous lifestyle. Despite their flight, their large hooked wing claws seem ideal for climbing, and their tail also functions as an extra limb, which are both adaptations typically seen in animals for traversing high areas. As well as moving through the thick forests, seaside cliffs and mountains of the area surrounding the citadel, this could further be a hint that Malzeno entered the caves and other subterranean environments in search of food. The tail is now no longer just prehensile, but ends in a grasping pincer, which is pretty ideal for rootling and pulling prey out from the areas the rest of your body is too big to fit in, such as the crevasses in caves, especially if you're using your other limbs hanging from a vertical surface otherwise, like the cliffs of Gaismagorm's opening. The tail being used potentially in prey handling may also suggest Malzeno eats smaller and feisty animals, keeping snapping claws, jaws or stingers at bay from the main body, as seen in its turf war with Lunagaron. Whilst Malzeno is capable of taking larger prey, it's possible small prey also make up a fair chunk of its diet too. Tails for predation are often for small, swift, mobile prey, where multiple ones can be dispatched with strikes of the tail, like that of a thresher shark. So Malzeno may also take a good chunk of small prey on the wing, and this is why it initially pursued the curio too. They look much like prey it often takes in other aspects as well. Overall, there's still a lot to speculate on with the bizarre relationships the curio can form with elder dragons, and the impacts it can have on the surrounding world. The actions of Malzeno, Primordial and Gaismagorm may just be a brief snapshot in a long-standing period of competition and evolution that had been going on for millennia and we're only just starting to learn about now. For my thoughts on the two elders of Sunbreak, to start with Gaismagorm, I really like him. In fact, after a lot of time to think, I believe he rivals and may well exceed a Cantor for me. Certainly he's a better fight, and whilst the final phase can get a bit flashy, it's a flashiness that complements the atmosphere of the fight and the theme of the monster, over just area of effect spam to try and make it difficult, and even then he still doesn't get lost in it completely. There's a lot of thought clearly put into his design too, with clear traits from burrowing animals, and yet he still feels sufficiently alien and derived for his rank and role. The mouth for a start, obviously, but also especially the fact he has 6 limbs with them not being wings, makes him feel a lot weirder than other hexapodal vertebrates in the series, and of course the whole thing with the curio too. Overall, a real winner of a boss. I think he has some interesting implications too. One for more elders on the gore skeleton, but without using the extra limbs as wings, instead as other tools or limbs could make for some interesting and refreshing elders in the future. And the thought of an entire underground map is also pretty cool. Malzeno I do still like, but I'm a lot more mixed on. On one hand, the very heavy theming in base Malzeno really worked in its favour to make it a very camp Hollywood vampire dragon that actually has some lore as to why it was that way, and I still think Primordial Malzeno is pretty good. But on the other hand, I can also see them returning inexplicably with curio in future games. And in general, much like Gore, they're already feeling like they're going to be a really reduced experience outside of their initial game. Their super speed is also a little weird, and some aspects of the fight can also get a little much. I do get the impression that even if the story of Sunbreak was planned out from the start, The designs of Base and Primordial may be werned, so great is the difference between them, even if you make up some worn down by Qurio headcanon. Plus the fact that Base Malzeno has and is initially shaped by such heavy vampire theming, and yet this is seemingly just an irreverent infected individual also feels like a bit of a disconnect. It feels like they made Malzeno clearly taking it in one direction, without thinking of what the variant would be, and then having to build said variant off something they intended first and foremost to be a vampire. But in Sunbreak at least, they're both still pretty decent. I'm a bit mixed on Primordial being the last update though. On one hand, Amatsu feels like the perfect ending to Ichinose's portable game, and the sun literally breaking after was great. But on the other hand, Primordial ends the Qurio and Sunbreak storyline, even if it feels a little bit after the fact, and like it had been forgotten in earlier title updates, even if they claimed such monsters were hunted for the virus cure. I think both work to an extent, I'm just unsure on the order of everything. I did enjoy the fact Primordial wasn't really the villain, and survived the story. Maybe not done quite as successfully as Theodeus, but it was still a nice touch, and better than just killing everything in sight. With the ending of Sunbreak, it's also the end of the 5th generation of Monster Hunter, the one that launched it into the stratosphere and its most controversial. Whilst individual gameplay choices and the mainline portable divide will ensure a good deal of arguing in the future, there can be no doubt that both the success, the aspects that made it successful, and the general series facelift will always make 5th gen the controversy generation, as much as the overall game changer. Whilst Mainline's next game will probably be similar in ideals to World, and possibly a direct sequel, although I personally don't see it being set in the new world again, the future of the portable series seems less certain. Rise itself was both a big homage to Portable 3rd and Generations, as well as likely doubling down on aspects of the former and the more anime vibe to try and recapture Portable 3rd's success, in case of the gamble of World doing badly. But it's hard to see the games getting more anime without just turning into something else entirely. And you also can't just homage those two games again. Ichinose did still make Freedom 2 though, so after the anime peak of Sunrise, maybe the next portable game will be a more grounded experience, with a smaller scope, if that's the last title he hasn't really paid much tribute to, who knows. The conspicuous lack of a Cantor and Yukon loss in 5th gen would set them up for this in 6th gen though. One thing I really do think may occur is playing as the monsters though. Wyvern riding in a way feels like it's setting this up, and it allows for the fast, short gameplay rounds that Portable wants to produce. Left 4 Dead perhaps most prevalently, but other series like Gears of War have successfully implemented such modes to considerable fan appeal. Others like Evolve have really flopped. But whilst I doubt there'd actually be a proper monster campaign, and I'd envision it more like the Rampages or just playing as the monster in a target quest, I think it is quite possibly Portable's next big thing. We'll have to wait and see. One thing Sunbreak does show is just how far the team have come in their ability to tell a story too. From literally just reading a novel off the screen with the precious rarity of a CG video in 4U, to far better implemented cutscenes, follower quests with dialogue potential, and literally everything about the afflicted Lunagaran quest before Gaismagorm, one of the most memorable and atmospheric quests in the series, Monster Hunter now does have all its ducks in a row to actually tell a proper story to its full effect. The final thing it needs is a good writer, unfortunately. But if they can hire one for Resident Evil, they can hire one for Monster Hunter too. But overall, there's generally a lot to be excited for in 6th gen. Thanks for watching, and thanks again to top patron Phenomenon for sponsoring this video themselves, and to the Superest Duper for their ongoing generosity as a top patron too. Thanks as well to K Sandom, Big Al, Erengar Steiny, Flygon's Archives, Sassy Birdo, Inventory Overflow, Tristan Berry, Evilly, Howleth, Archazor Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Carazol, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuratsu Bakumatsu for their continued kindness in keeping the channel going. If you're interested in doing so too, there's a link to the Patreon in the description, and I appreciate any amount. Thanks as ever to Kamen Rider Moten for creating the digital artwork of both Gaismagorm and Malzeno, especially for dotting so many curio everywhere by hand. For more of her original artwork, links are provided in the description for her assorted social media for you to check out. And Kamen creates plenty pieces independent of my videos too. Thanks too to I Am the Kaijuking for both the regular and primordial Malzeno skulls. For more skulls, more artwork and original content, be sure to follow him on Tumblr, and if you can, support his Patreon too. Links to both are provided in the description. Malzeno and Gaismagorm are pretty unknown elder dragons, so this was a very speculation and theory heavy video. As such, it's a good time for the reminder my videos aren't canon, merely just speculation indeed. This is just one possible explanation of the events around the glorified custody battle between Dracula and General Ram, but hopefully everyone still enjoyed this one, and it wasn't too out there. I initially did want it to be somewhat more Malzeno based, but the script became what it became. Next time, another non-Monster Hunter video, and one that's more of a commentary than an analysis, so we'll see how that goes, and hopefully I'll see you there for it.